So the Digit Lab is a research program that is called a Next Stage Digital Economy Research Center, funded by a variety of funders, led by the EPSRC, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and the two programs that they run, one in digital economy and one in manufacturing for the future. What it's focused on is how large established organizations reimagine themselves in this digital age. We are, of course, interested in basic digitizing of programs, processes, introduction of technology. But mostly what we're interested in is the transformational activities that occur in organizations when digital technologies get used and applied. So what we'd like to do here is focus on those transformational ideas and what the research challenges are and how we're addressing those. Next slide, please. Remember that this is one of 5 key presentations that you can see during this week of Digital Leaders activities. Today, we've got this overview, and over the next few days, there is some presentations around how we look at data sharing, particularly how data exchanges and data trusts are being used for sharing of data. We're looking at some of the organizational challenges that occur when digital transformation occurs. We're looking at some government activities as a sort of case study in large-scale transformation, looking at the UK government's journey over the last few years. And finally, we'll be looking at digital twins. Next slide, please. So once we start to think about digital transformation, we face a number of really interesting challenges. Of course, we're seeing digital technologies being used in many different areas. It's not a new concept, and it's certainly not new to introduce digital technologies. We've seen that over the last 20, 30, 40 years or more. But what's interesting is how we view some of the key challenges when we're beginning to innovate from a digital perspective. Next slide, please. So why don't we start with a very simple model of what we mean by innovation and look at the implications of being in a digital world on innovation. Now, there are many ways we could think about innovation, but I'd like to just take a very simple model that says there are 3 key components of innovation. The first is what's feasible with the technology. What does that technology allow us to do? The second is what's desirable to users. What do people want from the innovation? How do we understand their needs? And the third is what's viable in the marketplace. How do we look at the value they create? How do we look at the financial situation, the business model? How do we look at how participants in an ecosystem form these kinds of relationships to ensure that the technologies we introduce, that the changes that occur are viable? So the first is about the feasibility. Next slide, please. Once we start to think about feasibility, we start to think about that in the context of a massive set of changes going on right now, particularly with a number of emerging technology capabilities driven by digital technologies. Therefore, a lot of the kinds of research activities are about investigating what's feasible with new technology. So we may be looking at Internet of Things technology or new communication technologies with 5G and now 6G technologies. Perhaps we're interested in some things that are happening with additive manufacturing and 3D printing and other sorts of technologies. Each of these brings a new capability that organizations can begin to use to solve problems. So the first kind of research problems are around what's the feasibility of that technology, how is it growing, what does that enable us to do? The second is around desirability. As we begin to think about new ways to solve problems, and in particular, the changing or the rising expectations of users, what they expect to be able to do with these technologies is changing. Therefore, we see a lot of research saying, how do we understand user needs? How do we begin to examine what people want from these technologies and how those needs translate into different ways of working, different ways of operating? The third is in the viability in the marketplace. A lot of work is happening right now to think about new forms of business models. Take an example of how we move from selling products to selling services to selling outcomes. As business models change to look at how we look at the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, we have to radically rethink what it means to work with partners, with other sorts of organizations, in order to deliver that value in ways that recognize that value and look at how it gets distributed across those partners. So there's a lot of work going on right now in the literature looking at the implications of these new business models and what they mean for organizations as they evolve. So these give us a few early indications of where and how research is being directed. Next slide, please. This is leading to a whole new set of techniques. Some of these many of you are already familiar with, perhaps. For example, how minimum viable products become a way of deriving new experimental activities inside an organization to learn about the use of new technology adoption. Or perhaps how we're looking at the modeling of users' needs and their experiences through personas and empathy maps, maybe looking more about how we apply anthropology to looking at the lifestyle and uses of technologies in context. I'm sure many of you are familiar with lots of these ideas, but we're continually seeing new techniques being investigated and being transitioned into early practice. Next slide, please. This has influenced a lot of new ideas, but in particular, the work that I'm doing in investigating the application of those new ideas focuses on 5, what I will call critical dilemmas that we face as we look at how these new ideas affect practice. One is about productivity. How do we understand individual productivity, team productivity, organizational productivity in industries that are radically changing? Do we use traditional techniques? Do we find new techniques to measure productivity? How do we look at that in this digital world? The second is what we mean by value. As we've seen, our whole perspective on what we value, what we think is important to us, how we prioritize, has changed significantly, particularly with some aspects of perhaps sustainability or environmental concerns that are rebalancing what we think is important to us. The third, of course, is about ethical concerns. As we introduce new digital technologies, we're able to understand more about people's behaviors. And in particular, as we gather and use personal data, we raise a number of ethical concerns about what we want to occur, what should occur, how the legal systems around us keep up to date with the needs and issues that are created through digital technologies. So there's a massive amount of investment going on in understanding the ethical implications of things like, for example, artificial intelligence. The fourth is around leadership. What does it mean to lead an organization in a digital world? There's a lot of activity to understand what leadership styles are important, how we blend leadership styles to move away from classic bureaucracy, perhaps to more meritocracy or even adhocracy, where we focus on moving fast to solve problems. And then finally, as we do all of this, we affect individuals. We affect their mental health and physical health. We affect the stresses on them. We change the way in which jobs are defined, how people look at work and their work-life balance. We affect large parts of how we think about ourselves as humans in a digital world. These 5 areas I call dilemmas, but they're also major research programs. People are looking at all of these areas as really important aspects of how do we see our future. Next slide, please. That leads us to the specific DigitLab focus. What are the areas that this DigitLab focus is trying to address to give us new insights? So here I'd like to introduce Saeema Ahmed-Kristensen, the director of the DigitLab, to give us a few thoughts on how the DigitLab program is addressing some of these areas.
Thank you, Alan. We've got a number of partners that we work with across a set of domains that are broadly healthcare, food production, construction, law, professional services, and education. And we see a number of challenges, and I think they picked up quite nicely with Alan's look at the dilemmas, thinking about values, thinking about people, and thinking about technology. The first is around technology testbeds. And this one brings together both computer science, but also understanding how does technology move outside of a lab. When you develop algorithms and research around digital technology, whether it's AI or big data, for it to be meaningful to industry, we want to understand how you scale the adoption. What does it mean to the industry partners? What technologies are available? What are the roadmaps for them? And this technology work package, or challenge, as we say, will look at how we develop technology to look at data-driven design, to bring in innovation, to look at how we scale from the lab algorithms to something that's deployable within a factory setting, within a manufacturing setting. The second one is on business models. So as we move our digital technology to new business offerings and services, and move from products to services, or have digital parts of a product, we also need new types of business models. So the challenges that are faced by LEOs in understanding as they adopt digital technology, what are the new types of business models available, is the core of this challenge. We have a business model toolkit that's been tested in a number of sectors, for example, food manufacturing. And as part of our research, we hope we'll be evolving that to understand how business models and the different types of business models that are available depending on your manufacturing or other type of business contexts and the type of technology available. We can move to the next one, please. The third part, so we have the business models, so the value that's created to the different stakeholders, and we have the technology, but we also need the people within the organizations. And this has a reflection on how you organize structures. So this work package, or challenge as we call it, looks at what is the best type of organizational structure, what are the leadership type challenges that are relevant, how do we design digital technologies and platforms to promote responsible digital transformation. So one thread of our research that cuts across all of these challenges is responsible innovation. And this speaks to the values and the ethics that Alan highlighted as part of the dilemmas. The fourth part is the impact on individuals. So we all know that digital technology and transformation, whether they're digital or any other type of transformation, has an impact on employees. We have to deal with change. So what we're looking at here is understanding if we can measure the impact of individual well-being, and also if we can intervene and promote well-being. What we're currently doing is creating an open source app which will collect data about stress and look at how we can build upon this app in an open source way and tailor that for the context of each individual company who wants to use it, but also other academics. So can we monitor how people become stressed, and what do we need to do? So if we start connecting these challenges, what do we need to do in terms of an organizational structure to promote individual well-being? And the final challenge talks about digital innovation and data-driven design and data-driven innovation. We are looking at three different perspectives in here. One is, as we start adopting digital technologies, how do product development processes need to change? And how does that reflect on the type of tools we use? How do we represent human knowledge in there? So how do we customize products and services for the different users that we have? The second part of it is looking at digital rollout. So platform thinking is one of the ways forward in understanding how digital innovation takes place. And we're looking at case studies in the healthcare and public sector around that. And the third part is looking at ethics and risk. How do we set ethics and risk as we bring in new technologies? What are our responsibilities to our users and our consumers?
Thank you. So if we can remove the slides now. What I'd like to do is I'd like to start to engage in a conversation around some of these ideas and introduce Malcolm. Malcolm was at the Financial Times. He's worked a lot as a technology editor, looking at new technologies, particularly in areas like China and Asia, but also around the world. How do you reflect on seeing some of those challenges that we described, and how does that relate to what you've seen as you've been looking at technology and its use and some of the issues?
Well, so I don't want to be Mr. Gloom, although I am, of course, a journalist, so it is in my nature. But it feels to me very much like, so I stopped being the Financial Times technology editor about a year ago. And somebody came up to me in the office the other day and said, "Oh, you left at the right time, didn't you? Because you know, when you left, everything was going fine, very exciting times. And since you've left, you know, it's not looking quite so rosy." So, I mean, I think that what's really interesting about the ideas that you guys are looking at is actually how are they going to integrate into the real world scenarios that we are facing over the next few years. So the first thing to say is, you know, we're obviously, well, the UK economy is already contracting. The US is also possibly going to be entering into a recession. We can already see, we just had the quarterly results for all the big tech companies, and we can see that the growth rate for the hyperscale cloud services are all slowing down very rapidly.
Yes.
And I guess, you know, a lot of these ideas rely on, I mean, they're sort of routes to growth, but they require investment. So to what extent are companies, you know, further down the chain going to be focusing on growth, and how much they're going to be willing to invest? Again, with the big tech companies, we can see that they are slashing workers. They are focusing on their core businesses. They're cutting their innovation departments. You know, I guess a lot of other companies will be in the same boat. So I think that's one really interesting thing, which is how do we continue to innovate, and what are the sort of easy wins? What are the easy wins that will work in any economic circumstance? The second thing that I think is really interesting is, of course, we've had during the pandemic this sort of incredible turbocharging of digital transformation, right? Everybody's invested a lot of money over the last few years in making sure that they have the tech and the capacity to work more digitally. But that feels like that phase is kind of over in the UK now, in the UK at least. I mean, obviously not everywhere, but companies are going back into the office. And now that we're going back into the office, are we reverting back to business as before? It feels like a lot of the elements that people have enjoyed about hybrid working certainly are now being baked in. But just in terms of, I think, the different silos within an organization, I speak as someone who is involved in an innovation project at the FT right now. So over the last year, I've spent a lot of time working with our product and tech teams and with our commercial teams and strategy teams and lots of other different departments. And we've sort of come together quite well. It's all worked quite well. Will that continue as people go back into the office, or will people go back into their silos? Or, you know, actually, you know, what are the challenges with you know, one set of people working from home, another set of people working in the office? Will that create other silos?
So I'm going to try and raise you out of your gloom a little by saying that this is actually a very good time, yeah, to be thinking about these issues, because what I would argue, and this is slightly flip phrase, but I don't mean it in an insincere way. One of my colleagues says, "That's great in practice, but how does it work in theory?" You know, the opposite way around to where you normally see it. Because I think what we've seen over the last, particularly the last couple of years with that turbocharging, is a lot of very fast movement, almost without thinking, almost without putting the research that's necessary into the thought about, so what does this do? How does it affect our work? What's the longer term issues? What's the dependencies that it has on existing ways of working? And as you described it, we're going through a little bit of a reset or a recalibration coming out of the pandemic and into a recession. We're starting to say, well, hold on a minute. What does that mean for our future? Yes, we can, you know, run and chase our tails a little bit, which we have been for the last 2 years. But we've got to also put something more fundamental in place that says, what does this mean? How do we change? What happens to our organizations? How do we think about the value we create? How do we create a sustainable environment, both financially sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable? So I'm hoping that gives us a real push to say that alignment between the practicalities we face today and the medium to longer term research goals will be better aligned. And that gives me some hope. How do you feel, Saeema?
I very much agree with you. And I would say one other thing around innovation. So when companies are pressed to look at the core operation, often the innovation and long-term thinking moves to the research centres. And that's where I think as Digit Lab, we have a role to play. Where our role is to look at long-term, it's always to look at long-term because we're research, although obviously we're working directly with the companies and hope to make an impact with them. So I think we've got a space there while they work, if companies have to focus right now on the here and now and the economic challenges they're facing, we have a space to try and think about what's going to happen 3-4 years time, what's going to help get them out of this recession, what is the next thing coming.
I think the other thing we might also suggest is there's always I think a necessary gap between the state of the practice and the state of the art. And sometimes that gap varies for different reasons in different areas. And we have to view research from both directions, either coming from the state of the art, what can we create, and then how can we look at the necessary translation of that into practice. But also we have to look from the practice and say, what are the key challenges and where do we need research improvements or leaps that will move us forward into a different way of working. And maybe I can ask you a little bit what you see when you look out. What do you see as being the opportunities, perhaps from both of these directions, if I can crudely characterize you as one looking down from the research and one looking up from the practice. So let's start with you, Malcolm. Looking from practice, what do you see saying, these are the big leaps that I see or would hope to see?
Well, I mean, I think that's very fair what you've both said, that actually companies are ditching their wackier growth ideas, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We've seen a lot of lots of terrible ideas over the last few years. You know, whole industries have found funding that actually would not have found funding in perhaps more normal times.
Yes.
So that's great. And but then, you know, what we will have then, I think, is a focus on core businesses and things that can be easily monetized and things that actually are more practical use perhaps than some of the more blue sky thinking that we've seen. And just as a slight addendum to that, I do also agree with you that companies have got this capacity now, they've got this technological capacity, but maybe they don't all know how to use it to the best advantage.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, there isn't anything out there you know, I think we did a lot of work at the FT over what our hybrid model should look like. And of course, nobody has ever really looked at this before. So, you know, we can do all sort of polling, surveying workers and so on, but ultimately it will be useful further down the line to have some idea of what best practice looks like. In terms of things that are coming up that will be interesting, again, I suppose that the thing that's preoccupying me is that I think there's going to be much more possibly government-led interest in deep tech, right? We've already seen that, you know, this is something that China's been talking about a long time, and we can actually see it. China's a little bit ahead of everybody else in their political thinking on this, perhaps, but they've already decided that we don't really care that much about consumer tech, but we really do care about the science and, you know, the stuff underlying it all that we need to double down and invest in. And hopefully, you know, we'll see that also in the US and you know, and in the UK and elsewhere. So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested, of course, in what happens in a sort of, I mean, not a deglobalizing world, but a world where there are more barriers, and certainly more barriers, both in terms of tech talent and also in terms of hardware, right? I mean, we can see that supply chains are being bifurcated and also talent is being sort of bifurcated, and what happens there.
And what do you see from the research side down, perhaps? What are the big things that you would point to saying these have promise?
Yes. I think some of the themes that you've just touched on, Malcolm, actually are also resonated in their research. So resilience of supply chains is one of the themes that's really come through in the last few years, obviously because of the pandemic, but also Brexit and other issues going forward. But that leads to understanding data exchanges, understanding how the data trust works, the governance of data, how you motivate the sharing of data from one stakeholder to the other to cross the supply chain. We've also seen a trend in digital twins, which is used as it's used in lots of different ways, but partly looking at supply chains would be one of the issues around that. But I think data and sharing data beyond one part of the company to the other, but with other firms and other stakeholders for not just productivity, but also sustainability. That's the other thing that's come through. And I think the third one, which is reflected in our work package, one of the work packages, is understanding the individual. I think in the pandemic, focus on well-being became more and more dominant. And people are less, I think Alan points to this quite often, you talk about the great resignation during the
Yes.
and this quiet quitting, and just being in a job is not enough. So well-being is quite important and part of that.
And I think what we've learned from our research that I'm hoping is being picked up by others in research is the multidisciplinarity of it, the connectivity between disciplines. So often what we talk about is the need for a combination of data science, computer science, and social science. And, I think it's that relationship that has become even more important as we've looked forward and said, it's not just about we can create a new technology, but we have to understand its impact on individuals, on the organizations, and perhaps on economies and societies. And I think that's part of what we're witnessing right now is almost the shaking out of that. As Carlota Perez would say, in that fifth industrial revolution, we're in that period that comes between the early engagement where we see the disruption and the final period when things start to settle out. What's also interesting to me is I know a little bit, and I've heard you talk before a little bit about the Financial Times' own digital transformation.
Yes.
And its experiences over the last few years, because you went through that massive shock of the COVID period, and I would argue you came through that pretty well. And maybe you could make a comment or two about that, and perhaps what that means for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we had, whether by genius or whether by chance, we had put all of our digital transformation in place. I think the last bit of it we had a new content management system to publish everything on the website, which went live, I think, very early March 2020.
Good timing.
But it enabled everybody to be able to publish onto our website from their phone and from laptops and from everywhere else. And yes, I think, we had very good luck on that. What we've been doing since actually has been quite interesting. So I'm involved in as I said, a sort of a growth project, which is sort of a diffusion line, Financial Times. It's the Emporio Armani of the Financial Times. We're basically we had a lot of new audience come to us during the pandemic, and we looked at them and thought, this is a potential opportunity, but they're probably not going to be comfortable with the price point of our core readership. What sort of price point might they be interested in? What sort of offer might they be interested in? We did a lot of research. We looked at a lot of data to try and work it out. And we put together an MVP very rapidly. I think we built it in under 6 months from start to finish, an iPhone app. And then from that, we've basically been iterating and evolving and also gathering more data, understanding a little bit more about what this audience wants. And I think that's a very different way of working for us. This was the first app that we built for, I think, a decade. But we just decided, okay, we're just going to pull people from all different parts of the business and put them together in a room. We'll take some outside expertise and we'll do a lot of research and we'll see what we can do in a short period of time at a low cost.
Well, of course, when we talk about research, when most people other than academics talk about research, that's what they mean. They mean rapid experimentation in the practice, and looking maybe incrementally ahead, using some new technologies and adapting them to help you to be able to do that. And the ability, because of digital technologies, for you to create something new in 6 months would probably have been inconceivable 5-10 years ago.
Yes.
Both because of the technology, but also because of you, how you were organized, how you managed, how you worked, how you governed, how you looked at your role. So I think we've seen that change be a significant one. And I think one of the challenges I think we all face is aligning different views of research, the near-term view and the longer-term view, and making sure that we understand the value that both bring. And I think what we're going to face in the next couple of years is a bringing together of those, particularly in the current difficult environment. And tell me a little bit more about maybe one or two of the things that you are spending your time on right now that people in this audience might either be surprised by or might say, that's something that I need to look into a little bit more. Are there one or two areas either of you would like to suggest?
Well, I mean, I think, sorry, what I'm obsessed with at the moment is slightly niche, so possibly not of huge interest to the participants in this meeting, but I'm looking at how do you understand your audience? How do you reach that audience, and what are the ways in which we use other platforms to reach those audiences?
I don't think that's niche at all. I think that's really cool.
Well, okay. I mean, it's basically, when we went to market on the Apple App Store without really understanding how the App Store functions. And if you think about this marketplace, 2 million apps are launched every year there. So how do you work with discoverability and all of those things? And the App Store is changing all the time. So how do you work in line with its functions? But then, of course, other places where our audience might be, these huge new social media platforms. We are about to launch an influencer campaign, which is not something I would have said. The FT has certainly never done it before, and and working out how that online economy works, basically.
I'd be fascinated to know who FT thinks are influencers. Is it the head of the Bank of England, or are you talking about others?
No, for this audience, actually, the first person that we've signed up is a chap called Stephen Bartlett. Do you know him? He's on Dragon's Den. He has the #1 business podcast in the UK. He talks to entrepreneurs. I think his podcast is called Diary of a CEO. So he's in line both with the FT and also with this.
Interesting. Saeema, what about you? What would you point to as something that perhaps the audience might not have expected?
Well, not expected. I'm not really sure. But what I'm working on actually aligns not. It's coming from a different perspective, but as aligns a little bit with what you're talking about. Is understanding how knowledge of consumers and users can be embedded into the design of new products and services. And that is interesting because you move to smart products, but it's also interesting when you are talking about Internet of Things and when that experience comes from multiple products and services together and understanding. So what we've just been doing is reviewing the state of the art in research, and now we're close to looking for case studies and moving that.
Excellent.
I've been really interested in hearing more about that.
And I think a lot of what happens with IoT, if I may, is that you are searching for that context. You're constantly searching for that context. I want to know not just that you bought this thing, I want to know what you're using it for, when you're using it. If it's different in the morning or in the evening, if it's different when you're with somebody else, if you handle it differently in a different way because of the different usage context. And our ability to instrument both the physical devices themselves and the environment around us gives us completely new insights than we had before.
One thing that I've certainly come across is that, so I think a lot of obviously software engineers are in their 20s and 30s, and so they design products for people, that's their experience, which is how we ended up with an app with a font that's slightly too small for my wife to read.
That's the case with most design students. They always design for themselves or their aspirational selves.
Well, more broadly, of course, that issue of bias, because I'm the developer and I develop it knowing what I know with the blinkered view that I have of life and society and how people use technology is, of course, a major challenge. Not just the font's too small, but I expect certain things of who the audience is and how they think and how they work and what their cultural background is. And that, of course, is a major issue that we all face. And we know there's a lot of research activities going on looking at that. How do we understand
inclusivity as
exactly
well?
Both biases.
Particularly, I mean, it was very important for particular users during the pandemic and how they were not able to use digital technologies for communication. So yes, that's really
Are there one or two questions maybe we can pick up from the audience? We've got Lena helping us here with a couple of questions that might be useful. Are there any you could read out that might be particularly useful to to address.
So, Saeema, when you were talking about the work packages, especially the one about well-being, someone asked, how can you balance this stress information with GDPR rules?
That's a really important question, and the answer is they have to be balanced with the GDPR. So when we go through research studies, we need to go through ethics processes, and they're very strict processes that are run through the company. Not through the company, through the university. And that's in the design of all our studies. So it's not just in these collecting of the data. And questions such as where that data is stored, who's storing it, the availability of it, the privacy and security are all things that we need to look at. So that's carefully being thought out.
I would say though that, of course, the key to all GDPR is consent, right? So
Yes.
if you're looking to hold information on your employees and their stress levels, as long as those employees have consented, then it should be straightforward.
That's
I
right.
was really struck during the pandemic that one of the big consultancies, and I've forgotten which one it was, PwC, or they offered wearables to all of their staff as part of a way of monitoring their health, mental health, well-being, so on. And I thought, there's no way anybody will sign up to this, right? I mean, I certainly wouldn't sign up to being monitored by my company, 24 hours a day through a wearable. But the take-up rate was fast, and actually I must go back and find out what happened next. But I think people, as you say, are very keen on understanding their own well-being a lot more, and so would be willing to participate.
And I think this broader data collection issue, of course, is one of the major issues that we're facing and will face over the coming years. How do we store information? How do we manage it? How do we ensure personal information is not something that we're exploiting people with, but we're actually encouraging and supporting people with? And I think we'll see a lot of changes in our attitude and our approach to that. But for the research work, what's interesting is even in the ethics area, how you collect that data, how you understand what ethics means in the digital world is itself undergoing a digital transformation. So many people, particularly, for example, in research organizations, are only just beginning to reach the point where they understand that we're able to gather data on a continuous basis from inside your body. And that has certain implications. And how do we deal with that? We don't deal with it in the same way that you would do a paper-based survey. So how do we manage that? And I think we've got a lot of catching up to do there.
Which I think ties very nicely into a comment that a participant made about the importance of all of this innovation to have a people-centric approach. And I think this one is from Malcolm. So how do you identify your target audience who would need digital innovation?
That's a good question. I mean, I can identify I can talk about how we identified our target audience for this new app.
That would be good.
But that may not necessarily be the people who are looking for digital innovation inside the head. So in our case, we made it very simple for ourselves. We looked at the different segments of the FT audience. And we went out and looked at this new segment and said, where do they fit broadly, demographically, what are their interests? And we then asked, we did very large surveys where we asked a lot of people what they wanted and asked them to come forward. But ultimately, the target that we established was we have a very large audience of students. So I think there are 800,000 university students who, through their universities, have licenses to read the FT and who are reading the FT once a month. Once they graduate, of course, they can't afford the FT anymore. So whilst that cohort is very well represented among FT readers, 21 to 36 is much less well represented. So we thought, well, that's probably a good place to start, right? Here's a group of people who are already engaged with us. Can we take them over the bridge at a different price point?
I think that also is something from the university point of view, from not the research perspective, from the learning perspective, from the teaching perspective. One of the areas that we might also suggest is a big area for research right now is learning analytics.
Yeah.
Trying to see how people engage with materials.
Right.
And I'm sure you look at it from one point of view, from the FT, from a university point of view, the idea that we've digitized learning because we've got a YouTube video of a lecturer pointing to slides, or because we've got a learning management system where you can download the slides.
Yeah.
And that's a very small baby step. to us digitizing the learning experience. And I think where we'll see that going is a much more engaging learning analytics approach that says, how are you engaging with different sorts of materials? Which materials? How does that change your behavior? How do you interact with people about that material? And then how can we personalize that to your needs? And I think there's some strong correlations there with how you engage with the FT's journalism and its other materials, and how we're looking at the learning experience. And then, of course, those two have to merge somehow. And I think that's going to be an interesting journey.
The other thing that we did was to look at the problems that people were having. And there were two big problems that actually were common to all news consumers across all demographics. And those were, one, the feeling of being overwhelmed by the news cycle, by never being able to finish the news because there's always more news and you have to go back to the website for the latest thing that is happening. And the second one was spending all day reading the news, but finishing the day without really understanding what was driving those events.
Yeah.
So we tried to address those two things with the design of our diffusion line.
And I think that's another clear challenge right now from a research futures point of view is we used to be sort of content poor, but we had a lot of analysis of that content. Now we're sort of the inverse.
Yes.
Where we're bombarded with content, and the issue is what do we look at and how do we make sense of it? And I think that shift is quite interesting, again, from a learning point of view and from a journalism point of view.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe we can bring things back to a sort of final couple of minutes here just to conclude. Maybe there's one or two things that we might want to finish up with and allow each of you to have a sort of final comment, and then we'll just do a final wrap up. So maybe, Saeema, I can ask you just to give a final comment of the future of research, how you see that, and what some of your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I think some of future of research is a really big one. So future of our research on Digit Lab. I think there's some of the challenges that are facing the economy, the UK and the global issues, sustainability, productivity, well-being, and their linkages between them. That is something that's driving us. So when we're thinking about digital innovation, we're not just thinking about the users. We're not just thinking about technology. We're thinking about economic growth, but we're also thinking about how we can make a difference to sustainability. So I think that would be one of the
Great, thank you. Malcolm?
Yeah, I would echo that exactly. Those are three big things that I think from a journalistic point of view, we're going to be paying a lot of attention to going forward. And already are paying a lot of attention to, obviously, but and one thing that I haven't spent enough time talking about is that sustainability piece, because that is one area that, never mind the recession and everything else, we know that there's going to be a lot of money spent coming down the line on the climate transition. And I think understanding what the routes are through it and how technology can play a role in that is a fascinating topic.
Great. Well, I'm going to draw this to a close now. I really appreciate your attention and taking part in this online discussion. So please get in touch with us through digit.ac.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get more people involved in the work that we're doing. So if you've got some ideas or there's ways in which you'd like to interact with us, please get in touch, and we'd love to hear more and tell you more about what we're doing. So thank you very much for this. Remember that there are 4 more presentations each day at 1 p.m. The Digit Lab research program will be presenting on key topics. We invite you to take part in those, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks very much, and thank you to Malcolm and to Saeema.